Another day, another mystery. Looks like James Webb Space Telescope discovered something else nobody has ever seen before, and something else that's currently impossible to explain. And you're sort of seeing it in this image. These are now referred to as platypus objects. And so in this video, we're going to discuss exactly what this is, or at least what scientists think it is, and why this is such a bizarre discovery. Well, hello info person, this is Anton. And if you've watched previous videos on this channel, you probably know that in the last few years, James Webb provided us with a lot of data consistently challenging our understanding of how the universe began. For example, in some of the previous videos, we discussed various types of objects that we never knew existed previously, such as the famous little red dots, that we kind of now understand a little bit better. But today we're going to discuss a brand new class of objects that currently completely defies classification systems and makes absolutely no sense to astronomers. And it was recently discussed in a study by Haojin Yang and the team from University of Missouri, where the researchers discovered 9 such objects in the early universe that they basically nicknamed Platypus galaxies. And I guess let's briefly discuss why. Let's briefly talk about platypuses. And it all started with Captain John Hunter. In 1798, he sent a sketch and a pelt of a very bizarre animal he discovered in Australia. And so by 1799, European naturalists started to scratch their heads. What exactly was this? And the first publication about platypuses was by George Shaw in 1799. But he actually expressed doubts this was real. He suspected that this was maybe some kind of a hoax, with other scientists suggesting that this was a fabrication by Chinese taxidermists that basically combined a duck's bill, a beaver's tail, and a mammalian body to create this bizarre animal. And so for several years, nobody took this seriously. But eventually, through additional specimen and further anatomical studies, European science eventually accepted that this was a real animal and represented a super strange egg-laying mammalian species, which suddenly opened up a new discussion in regards to how mammals evolved, because nobody believed any of this was possible. Now we'll probably discuss all of this in some of the future videos about platypuses and various biological discoveries about them, but that's essentially the main premise behind this discovery as well. Just like with the 18th century platypus, here researchers discovered several objects that seem to possess properties of completely independent objects, combining them into one single thing. And so here these bizarre galaxies, or whatever this is, possess a kind of a mishmash of features that simply should not exist together, at least according to modern physical models. And so here we have a very bizarre, mysterious point source. But to understand why this is mysterious, let's briefly discuss how we usually see these distant objects and what they normally represent. Now first we have galactic stars. These are basically stars inside various galaxies that produce very specific types of emissions. But when we look at these stars far, far away, especially in various clusters where new stars are forming, they tend to produce very specific emissions of different elements, but also produce what's known as a narrow emission line. Or basically emissions of, for example, hydrogen are going to be extremely narrow and almost spike-like, just like you see in this image. And so when we see these narrow lines and we see certain types of elements, we can almost always assume that we're looking at some kind of a star-forming region, such as some kind of a stellar nursery inside a starburst galaxy. These are very, very common, and we see them all over the place. But then we also have quasars, objects that are also visible from really far away and actually do resemble stars, which is why they're called quasi-stars, which is of course what quasar means. But in reality these are not stars, but central black holes that are extremely active and very, very bright. And so here everything is actually powered by a very powerful black hole, producing brilliant light as a result of the accretion disk and the jets. And normally a typical quasar outshines all of the stars in a galaxy, making the entire object appear as a single point of light. But because it's a result of the accretion disk where gas spins really fast around the black hole, it also produces what's known as a broad emission line. So basically not a spike, but instead something that resembles a kind of a shark tooth. And so when we see something like this, we know this involves a powerful supermassive black hole. And while for the previously discussed little red dots, that's exactly what researchers discovered there. They seem to possess a very broad line, implying that whatever is happening in the center seems to involve super powerful black holes, which is actually what we've discussed in one of the previous videos you can find in the description. But that's not the case for these newly discovered platypus objects. Despite being ridiculously bright and very far away, and despite being point sources, essentially really small in size, unlike little red dots, these objects do not possess broad emission lines. All 9 of them seem to possess extremely narrow lines, which means that the gas in this case is not swirling around at incredibly high speeds. And this is a fingerprint of active star formation typically found inside galaxies, not the environment around a quasar. But this is a major contradiction. These objects seem to be way too small and way too compact to look like any normal galaxy. In terms of size and appearance, they look like quasars, but in terms of the emission lines, they basically look like stars. So these are stars that behave like galaxies, which is why they decided to nickname these objects Platypus galaxies. But here the discovery was not an accident, because researchers were actually inspired by the search for little red dots and wanted to find even more of these objects, trying to see if some of them might be a little bit unusual. Just as a reminder, this is what a typical little red dot looks like. And while today we're pretty certain these seem to be unusual black hole objects surrounded by a massive cocoon of gas that then starts to glow. But these are also extremely compact. They're only a little bit bigger than the solar system in terms of size. And so even though they resemble tiny galaxies, they're definitely not. And so here the main question was, could we find other point-like sources in the early universe that could be maybe similar but just a little bit different? And well, out of 2,000 objects they examined, they found 9 that basically made no sense. So basically out of 2,000 objects, 9 were platypuses. And right now, there is absolutely no way to explain any of this. Actually, well, the only closest explanation we have is of another mystery referred to as the green pea galaxies. This was accidentally discovered in 2009 by citizen scientists, and they seem to represent galaxies extremely enriched in oxygen, with an extremely high formation rate of stars. But they're also relatively compact and relatively spherical, and it's not entirely clear how they formed. We've discussed them in some of the previous videos, but even today this is still a little bit of a mystery. And so in this case, platypus objects are somewhat similar, or at least they have very similar spectra. But there's one main difference. The platypus objects seem to be even smaller and even more compact. So essentially, unlike green pea galaxies, which at least in some sense resemble galactic shapes, here these objects are literally point sources. On top of this, for green pea galaxies, we are pretty sure they're galaxies because in some of the previous studies, scientists discovered that they're usually surrounded by an extended host of much older stars. So here we definitely have a stellar population around these green pea galaxies, obviously suggesting that these are galaxies and nothing else. Here's what one of these objects looks like in the ultraviolet, and you can kind of see some of the stars around it. But these new objects appear to have no such surroundings, and they're essentially hostless. They appear to be just forming, and once again they just appear as a single point source, but we're not entirely certain what the source actually is. It's assumed to be some kind of a star-forming region, but at this point nobody knows. And this is of course a ridiculously important discovery, assuming this is confirmed by other studies, because here it touches on fundamental questions on how exactly these first structures formed in the universe, and how all of the galaxies around us eventually started. Because in the standard model, we essentially have a kind of a hierarchical structure. In essence, we assume that galaxies grew through very violent, chaotic collisions, but it all started with a lot of dark matter and a lot of gas coalescing slowly over the years. And so galactic growth was always assumed to be the result of massive mergers. Mergers for billions and billions of years. But these platypus galaxies suggest a different path. Because they're so compact and because they're so small, and also because they seem to be forming stars in an extremely specific point-like structure, here this suggests a much more quiet and independent formation, not involving any galactic collisions, and basically not involving chaotic massive structures. Now this doesn't mean that none of this happened, of course, because we've seen these chaotic structures and colliding galaxies really far away, but what it does mean is that there might have been an alternative path, or maybe the early universe just had a lot of other objects that eventually disappeared or transformed into something else. But for astronomers, this also confirms a kind of unusual hypothesis, a concept known as the monolithic collapse. This is where a galaxy starts from a very compact core and starts to build itself up from inside out, instead of being smashed together from larger pieces. And so basically here this suggests that the early universe was a lot more flexible and way more creative in building all sorts of different galaxies we never imagined. But the problem is that we have absolutely no idea what happened to any of these objects, because we don't really see anything like this anywhere in the modern universe. And so basically here it's unclear exactly what this is going to become, or what sort of an object this is going to form. Now, one potential explanation that I've read in some of the other studies is that maybe this is actually how globular clusters began. Globular clusters are also very mysterious, and scientists have always had a lot of troubles explaining them. And so maybe that's what we're seeing here, except that this is a baby globular cluster. But that's of course just an assumption, and there is no evidence yet. As a matter of fact, the researchers in the study make sure that we understand that a lot of this is just based on initial observations, and the true nature of this object is still very uncertain. In other words, we have absolutely no idea what this is. Now technically this could also be some kind of a low luminosity black hole, or a kind of a type 2 active galactic nucleus that basically involves a relatively quiet black hole without any visible galaxy, or this could of course be some kind of a newborn star-forming galaxy that's extremely young, just a few million years old. And so in order to figure out some of these answers, the team is now planning to conduct additional spectroscopic analysis, while also trying to discover even more of these objects, in order to see if this is a widespread population we've never really seen before or missed by accident, or if these 9 objects are indeed unique and represent something super unusual. But honestly, right now, this particular object is a perfect example for why James Webb Space Telescope is so important and so incredible. It's essentially showing us these missing links in the cosmic history, and it's helping us find all kinds of bizarre objects we never imagined existed, that even no study or model ever predicted. These are so strange and so bizarre that right now everyone is just scratching their heads. And so just like the biological platypus that forced biologists to rethink the evolution of mammals, and to even rethink categories involving mammals and birds, here these galaxies or these bizarre objects are going to force us to rethink about certain categories of stars, galaxies, quasars, and so on. Which means that we'll definitely come back and discuss this more once there are some additional discoveries. Until then, check out some of the previous videos on very similar topics in the description below. Thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else. Support the channel on Patreon, where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM me directly, or by joining the channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.